Good evening, everybody. Good to see you all again, and welcome to tonight's presentation with Judy Hancock Holland, who is talking to us from beautiful Vancouver Island, British Columbia, where she says it's spring just like we've got, and she's got tulips out. Judy has a passion for teaching, which she's been doing for over 50 years, and an upside of the pandemic for her was that she found she was being invited to speak to groups all over the world about photography. Judy has already given a presentation to the Alternative View audience on the subject of abstracts. And as part of the Mono programme, her talk tonight is entitled High Key and Low Key. Tonight, I think she will exhibit images that will help us understand how contrast, texture, form, and light take on a new importance when colour is removed from the equation. For Judy, her art reflects her lifelong search for meaning and peace. She very much enjoys spending, sometimes many hours, exploring a single subject and works hard to reveal its essence in her images. I do know that Judy is especially fond of calla lilies, enjoying exploring their sensual form and curves. They even have their own gallery on her website. And that is where I found these words, which is her actual mission statement: to create luscious photographic art that invites you to rest in a moment of awe at the beauty of creation. So, Judy, I'm going to stop sharing and pass over to you. And I know that you'll be happy to take questions at the end of your presentation. So everyone, if you can use the Q&A to ask your questions when you're ready.
Thank you, Melanie. That's great. I'm going to share my screen and I'm working with two screens here. So I'll just get you rearranged a little bit over here and get started. So thank you very much for having me back again to speak to your group. I always enjoy it. You can take screenshots while I'm speaking if you want to, but I have provided Melanie with some notes that will address all the salient points. Right from the outset, I want you to take a look at these two images and I invite you to notice the difference in emotion between high key and low key. If I can make a musical analogy, high key is like treble, it's like flutes and piccolos and violins, whereas low key is more like bass, heavy, solid, like bassoons and tubas. So if you're a musical person, that may help you understand the distinction between these two. And keep those ideas in mind, not only during the presentation, but also when you're out shooting. My interest in high key and low key, particularly high key, started over 50 years ago. I was 18 years old, fresh out of high school at university, and my boyfriend at the time had this beautiful print on his wall of a young woman. This is not that print, but it's very similar. She was a young woman about 20 years old, and I, for the longest time, just enjoyed that print, thought it was so beautiful. And one day I commented and asked him, who did that lovely pencil sketch? And he said, that's not a pencil sketch, that's a photograph, and I did it. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. I could not believe that something like that could come from a photograph. And then I was away from photography for several decades, but when I came back to it, learning how to do this was one of the things that I wanted to do. It gives such an ethereal, soft look, and I really enjoy that. High key and low key are both all about tones and contrast. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. We need to think in tones, and I'm sure that that's been brought up in other talks in this mono series. But we need to think about both tones and contrast. We need to disregard the color and learn to see the gradations of brightness and darkness. So here we have dark to mid-tones to light. And then here you can see that the left column of colors is dark and the right column is lighter than those colors. Same hue, but lighter. And could you go lighter still? Well, yes, of course you can. Pale colors might invite a high key approach and dark colors might invite a low key approach if you have some light areas to produce some contrast with those colors. Now, I know this is a review for many of you who already understand histograms, but I want to talk about it briefly for those who might not. Your camera and your software both produce a histogram, which is basically just a bar graph of the tones in your image. The bars on the left represent the darkest tones, and the bars on the right represent the lightest tones. So this is a very crude bar graph. There are only 7 bars here, but the principle is the same with a histogram in your camera or your software. Each bar represents how much of that tone is present in the image. And so we can see we've got varying amounts of different tones represented in this bar graph. Now the bar graph looks a little different when you squeeze 256 tones into it instead of just 7. The vertical bars are much thinner, but they show how much of each of those 256 tones appear in your image. So this particular histogram indicates lots of light tones, a few midtones, and no dark tones. So this would be a high key histogram. Many quotes normal images would have a hump in the middle, but there's really no such thing as a correct histogram. It's only correct for what you're trying to achieve. The other side of lightness and darkness, the other thing we need to think about is contrast. So high contrast is just an abrupt change between the tonality of 2 areas, white next to black, light next to dark, for example. And low contrast is just the opposite, where you have a very gradual transition between the tonal value, the darkness or the lightness of the pixels. And I will throw in here that I find, for my work anyway, the contrast slider in your software is really not your friend. It's usually much more effective to adjust the blacks and the shadows, the highlights and the whites individually. Now, again, this might be a review for some of you, but it is very, very important when you're dealing with high key and low key. Your camera's light meter tries to make your frame average out to middle gray. That's its job. And that's fine for average scenes, but it gets fooled in any scene with big areas of brightness or darkness. So the camera will always try to make the tones in every photograph average out to middle gray. And if you don't compensate for that, either by using manual exposure or exposure compensation, bright scenes like a white cat in snow will be underexposed as the camera tries to make it all average out to gray. So it's going to look like a gray cat on a gray background. And a dark scene, like a black cat in a coal mine, is also going to look about the same. It will be overexposed and again look like a gray cat on a gray background. So using a gray card for exposure and setting your camera on manual exposure is one simple way to avoid that problem. And here's how that works. So the traditional way to get your exposure correct is to set your camera on manual and raw and then fill the frame with the gray card, as I've done here, and take a shot of that gray card and expose so that the histogram has a big peak right in the middle. And then you leave that exposure setting on those settings, and then any subject will be properly exposed as long as the light doesn't change. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Some folks misunderstand and they think that you overexpose for high key and underexpose for low key, but that's not really accurate. You're actually just overruling the camera's default of making everything average out to middle gray so that your subject is correctly exposed and appears as it actually is. Now, I was fresh out of cats and coal mines, so I used a couple of different subjects instead. My settings were f9, 1/15 of a second, and ISO 200 for this particular shot of the gray card. Then I used the same settings and I put a white bowl and plate on a white background and shot that. Didn't change the settings and the light didn't change. Then I shot a very dark subject with exactly the same settings and they both turned out correctly exposed. So if you want to do high key and low key, that can really help you. They're not as simple as it appears from the beginning, but if you use a gray card, you've really given yourself a boost in getting the exposure right. If you're outside, you're shooting landscapes on a sunny day, you can aim your camera at an area of blue sky, not too close to the sun, and take your reading from that. And that will give you pretty much the same exposure as a gray card would. Or you can use grass or foliage and reduce the exposure by 2/3 of a stop, and you should be right on. Now, the newer way of exposing is more suitable for digital cameras, and that's known as ETTR, or exposed to the right. Most of the data your sensor can collect is in the highlights and the whites. So if you want to capture all of that. And if you don't ETTR, then you're not going to get that data. So you do this by exposing so that your histogram just barely touches the right-hand edge. You can see the difference here between the ETTR and the traditional way of doing it. And you might want to turn on the blinkies, the highlight warnings, in your camera to avoid blowing out the highlights, because if you want any detail, you've got to avoid blowing out the highlights. Sometimes I blow out the highlights because I don't want any detail in the background. If I want a pencil sketch look, then I want the paper to not have any ink on it in the area of the background. So there are times to blow your highlights. I might be the only photographer you hear say that. Because everybody warns you about not blowing the highlights, but there are times to do it. You can always reduce the exposure in post if necessary, but that way you've got all the detail and you also are not introducing noise. So on to high key. What is high key anyway? Well, if you look it up on Wikipedia, it will tell you it's light tones without dark shadows, and it features a diminished tonal range of primarily whites and light grays. So the two key factors are mostly light tones and low contrast, which sometimes gets overlooked. The change in tone in a high key image is gradual. It's not abrupt or dramatic. It's very gentle. And you can do high key in color if you think of pastels or light pencil sketches, things like that. So here I've represented it with a Venn diagram. You can have images that are mostly light tones but aren't high key. You can have images that are low contrast but aren't high key. And when you get mostly light tones and low contrast, then you have a high key image. So we're looking for low contrast. It's not just overall lightness that matters, it's the low contrast as well. So what isn't high key? Well, just shooting something on a white background doesn't make it high key. And an image with any significant amounts of dark tones would not be considered high key, or an image with high contrast. So this image has too many darks and too much contrast to be considered high key. There are very dark tones right next to very light tones. In high key, your tonal changes are more gradual or more subtle. Similarly here, this would not be considered high key. While it looks like a pencil sketch in a way, it doesn't look like a high key pencil sketch. While it has mostly light tones, it also has high contrast. So you remember that part of the definition of high key was a diminished tonal range. Here, the tones range from pure white to pure black. So high key isn't just about brightness, it's also about low contrast. I wouldn't call this high key because there's too many dark and mid-tones and too much contrast. And if we look at the histogram for this image, you can see there's a significant bump in the shadow area of the histogram. Notice how different these two renditions feel. They're both made from the same raw file. The left one not only fulfills both the criteria of low contrast and mostly light tones, but it also feels significantly different. It's gentler, it's more subtle, it whispers. The one on the right is not high key. It has both too many dark tones and too much contrast. It feels bolder. So feeling is really important when you're looking at high key. Now, high key does exist on a continuum, like many things in life. The first shot is a high key shot, I would say. It's low contrast and it's mostly light tones. But the second one is even more high key. It has very few dark or even mid-tone pixels. It's mostly highlights and whites, and it has a much dreamier quality. This is the kind of high key that I'm really drawn to. I like that end of the continuum. So why high key? How do you choose a subject for high key work? We want to use high key when we have a reason to do so. The technique should suit the subject. You wouldn't shoot the villain in a murder mystery in high key. So think about subjects that are sort of light, feminine in quotation marks, ethereal, dreamy, gentle, airy, sweet. So you think about things like babies and flowers and lonely beaches. Simple compositions tend to do well in high key, and of course, a small range of tones and low contrast. And the background doesn't have to be pure white, but it does need to be light and uncluttered. And I find, I consider myself mostly a minimalist photographer, and I find that high key and low key, for that matter, often complement a minimalist composition. So babies are a classic subject for high key. In this portrait of my granddaughter, you can see how the effect emphasizes the softness and the vulnerability of the baby. This was a normally exposed shot taken by her dad, and then I used post-processing to render it in high key. Flowers can be wonderful subjects for high key. We were talking about magnolias before the meeting started, and they would be a wonderful subject for high key. This white calla lily on a white background was my very first experiment with high key, and it's still one of my favorite shots. It's a mostly white subject against a white background. When I first processed it, there was a darker spot where the stem met the blossom, and that contrast really drew the eye. So I had to use a luminosity mask and go in and lighten up that darkness so that there wouldn't be an area of high contrast to take the viewer's attention away from all those lovely curves. You can do high key in color. And one of the keys to doing this is to also desaturate the image. But I find that when it comes to high key, I almost always prefer monochrome. And of course, it's a matter of personal preference, an artist's choice. I've seen some lovely pastel look color images that are high key and quite lovely. This one was shot with a regular exposure on a white background, and then the shadows and blacks were raised in post. So you see the sort of quotes normal shot on the upper right, and then the color high key in the lower right, and then of course the black and white high key. This is mostly a high key image, but dark hair puts it closer to the end of the continuum. You can see that it's much easier to do high key when you have a blonde model. This would be considered a high key image, but I don't think the subject suits the treatment at all. Cacti are sharp and prickly, and high key is better suited to softer kinds of subjects. This does sort of suggest heat to me in the desert and bright sunshine. I think there's room for personal taste, but as a rule, I wouldn't use high key for this kind of subject. So let's go back to this image to look at its histogram. All the tones in this image are lighter than middle gray. And you can see that the histogram gets higher and higher the more we get into the lighter tones. This was one where I didn't mind if I blew out some highlights in the background. I don't consider this to be high key. The histogram is weighted to the right, as you can see, but there's too much contrast in this, particularly in this area down here where we have the tip of the calla lily. Others might disagree with me, but that's fine. Here, by lightening up those dark areas, this is, I think, a better example of high key. And again, I don't normally adjust contrast by using the contrast slider. I work with the blacks and the whites, the shadows and the highlights, or a curves adjustment. Here again, another histogram for a high key image. There's absolutely nothing in the middle of the histogram or to the left of it. It's all to the right of the center. Similarly here, have a look at the image, have a look at the histogram. There were areas in this tulip that were a little bit dark, particularly the base of the blossom here, and those had to be adjusted so that they wouldn't produce an area of high contrast. This is a very high key image of a birch tree, the trunk of a birch tree, the bark on it, and I've mirrored it to create an interesting effect. To me, living on the west coast of Canada, those look like salmon swimming along, but you get the idea. The histogram is way, way over to the right-hand side, and yet it doesn't go off the end on the right. It doesn't make a big peak right at the end. Fog can make for very nice high key, and I understand that in England as well as on Vancouver Island, fog is not that hard to find sometimes. Again, your camera will mismeter this. It will try to make everything average out to middle gray. So you're going to need to increase your exposure over what the camera actually recommends. Here's a subtle, wistful sort of high key image. The fog softens everything and reduces the contrast. So shooting for high key. You want to try to have a light colored subject, light tones. You want to have a light background. And soft light works best for high key images. Bright overcast outdoors works really well, or diffused off-camera flash. Hard light like direct sun is going to give you too much contrast. If you're out on a sunny day and you want to shoot a flower, have a diffuser that you can put between the flower and the sun, and that will soften the light so that you have a better chance of getting high key. And as I mentioned, you don't want to blow the highlights unless you do. And your camera, you need to compensate for its tendency to underexpose for high key and expose to the right. Always check your histogram and use your blinkies. And here's what a typical histogram for high key would look like. Nothing on the left and everything over on the right-hand side. And the more it is to the right, the further along the continuum it is in terms of high key. I didn't shoot this portrait with high key in mind. If I had, I probably would have asked her to wear a lighter colored top and jewelry that didn't contain any black. I seldom use a white vignette, but with high key portraits, it can enhance the look. So here I have used a high key, a white vignette to emphasize the high key nature of the image. And you can see that high key can soften the look for older women. This is my mother-in-law. She was in her 80s when I did this photograph, and I think she looks pretty terrific. If your whole subject is very light in tone, then it might lend itself to a high key treatment. And you can adjust the tones if necessary, of course. But even when you're shooting, keep that histogram over to the right, not centered. So this was a tulip that had nice, soft, pale colors. I wasn't thinking of high key when I took this dahlia image originally, but I realized it really didn't have any really dark tones in it. It was mostly midtones. So I could increase the exposure. The exposure slider affects your midtones, and then make some other adjustments to create a high key image. This one I shot like this, and this is the standard processing with a texture applied. And look at the histogram on this one, because I'm going to show you a different histogram with a different version of this in a minute. This has no true blacks, but it does have some shadows. It has quite a lot of midtones, and then it has some highlights and whites as well. So when we change that to black and white and adjust it for high key, you can see I've taken the exposure up by 1.85 stops. So almost 2 stops up on exposure to raise those midtones. And then I adjusted the shadows and blacks way up, all the way to 100%. And that has produced a high key image. So processing a normally exposed image to create high key work won't work on every shot, but sometimes you can get away with it, especially if there's no real dark tones in your original. But again, you're better to expose for high key in the first place. And these days I shoot everything with ETTR, and it works even for low key images. So I would suggest you go into your archives and make some virtual copies of some of your lighter shots and play with the sliders to get a feel for what's possible. You might find you have some images already that do very well in high key. Here we have an iris, and it's got my sort of standard processing. It's a simple subject with a light background. There are no really dark tones. There are some shadows. So it's a good candidate for high key. And so I worked with the sliders in Lightroom and came up with both a color and a black and white high key. In this case, I took the midtones, the exposure, up just over half a stop, the shadows all the way up, and the blacks way up, and then the saturation down for the color image. This is an almost perfect subject for high key. This was a calla lily with pale pink and yellow, and it was shot against a white background. Even so, there was some higher contrast in one area. This area just up here, I had to brighten up some of the darker tones so that it wouldn't immediately pull your eye to that area. And again, I used a luminosity mask to select just those darkest tones and then lighten them a little bit. So some final thoughts on high key. Number one, you want to have a reason for choosing high key to emphasize those ethereal qualities. High key is a tool. You want to match your subject and mood to the technique. Second point would be to expose to the right to get the best high key exposure. And as I say, I do that for everything now. And then to practice. Practice with everyday objects at home just to master the technique and watch for subjects that suit that high key treatment. You might do like I did, put a white plate and bowl in front of a white background and practice on that. You want to have the subject defined and you want detail, but you want that high key look. Subjects that you might practice with would be like kids, your grandkids, pets, plants. A lot of those kinds of things can be good for high key. Now, whereas high key is mostly light tones with low contrast, low key is mostly dark tones with high contrast, which means that you'll usually have some pure white or close to pure white in a low key image, but it makes up a small part of the composition. It's not just a matter of being underexposed, and you'll see that in a minute. We want to think about not only the overall darkness of the image, but also the high contrast. You need a bit of white or at least bright highlights to set off those dark tones. So what isn't low key? Well, something just shot on a black background. That doesn't make it low key. An image with a wide range of tones evenly distributed would not be low key. And an underexposed shot with no whites in it would not qualify. And again, there is a continuum of low key, just as there is with high key. So here, another Venn diagram. We have mostly dark tones, and you can have an image that's mostly dark tones, but isn't low key. And you can have high contrast that isn't low key. But when you have both and they overlap like that, then you have a low key image. So what is not low key? Here we have high contrast between the subject and background, but it's not low key because there's too many highlights and midtones in these images to be considered low key. Here we have drama and high contrast, but again, too much in the way of midtones and highlights to be considered low key. Look at your histogram. Here we can see the histogram for this image, and you can see there are lots of midtones and highlights in this, so it really doesn't work out as a low key image. And this is an underexposed shot. This is not low key, it's just underexposed. It's not the same thing. There's no whites here and it's low contrast. Whereas if we work with it and we create some contrast, bring up those whites, then it could be considered low key. So what makes a good low key image? Well, you want to have a reason, not just because it's cool. You want to have a subject and an intent that match the technique. Just like you wouldn't use high key for a murder mystery poster, you wouldn't use low key for, the tale of Benjamin Bunny or something like that. You've got to match the mood and the intent and the subject. Emotions, darker emotions like mystery, malevolence, danger, sexiness, drama, edginess, those are the kinds of emotions that might suit a low key treatment. Simplicity is often very effective in low key, and I might be a little biased on that because I am more of a minimalist, but I think that if you get too much going on in the frame, it doesn't maybe lend itself so well to low key. And high contrast, you want deep shadows and blacks and a few areas of highlights or white. So when you're shooting for low key, you want to have your subject, you want to have a dark background, you want to have often very bright, hard light. Cloudy days are not going to be suitable for this. You need a bright sunshine or very often an undiffused flash. And you want to expose for the highlights. You can see here in this histogram, it does touch the right-hand edge, and you just want to let the shadows fall off into darkness. It's fine to have areas of total black, but you have to have contrast. So the next slides will give you some examples. And this one might surprise you. It may be counterintuitive, but bright sun can be great for low key because as long as it's not coming from directly in front of the subject, it can create some really great shadows. This abstract is actually a white sheet that I exposed for the whites and I let the shadows fall to black. There's nothing else in this image except a white sheet on my bed that was rumpled up. You often see sand dunes shot this way. So the shadows, I just let them go to black, and the very, very bright highlights I exposed so they wouldn't be blown out, and everything else fell off. I did apply a paint effect to this because I didn't want the details of the weave of the fabric to be there. This was intended to be an abstract where you wouldn't know what it was, but I was shocked when I shot this white sheet and was able to get this kind of result. This is one of my favorite photographs. It was shot on a very bright sunny day in Victoria, BC. I exposed for the highlights and I let the shadows go dark. And when I turn it to black and white, then I cropped it to eliminate the brighter tones on the left-hand side and put a slight vignette on it and toned it with brown. This makes it more of a low-key and minimalist kind of shot. Which version you prefer is a matter of personal taste. I haven't made up my mind yet. I think I like them both. This was an image, an abstract image that started out as just a shot of a slinky, you know, the old-fashioned toys we used to play with in the 50s and 60s. This was a slinky shot with a bare, undiffused flash and then distorted in an app called Circular Pro. And if you look at the histogram again, you can see there are lots and lots of dark tones, some true blacks, and there is a little bit of white. That histogram does stretch all the way to the right-hand side, indicating we have some highlights and some whites. This was bright sun breaking through the clouds on a very cloudy day. And so it made a very dazzlingly bright area on the ocean there. And I exposed for those dazzling whites and let everything else go to shadow. And so it was bright sun that turned into a low-key image. This one was taken with bare off-camera flash, a little bit behind the calla lily. Lots of dark tones and high contrast. Again, when you look at the histogram, it does show some white, and that's what creates the contrast. This is a pretty typical low-key histogram. Lots on the left, only a little bit on the midtones and highlights and whites. This one again was done with an off-camera flash with just a small diffuser because I wanted to make the shadows a little bit softer. I didn't want absolutely hard edge shadows, but we do end up with a low-key effect there, and you can see the histogram there. There's a little bit more midtones and whites in this one, but it still would qualify as a low-key image. This was a dimly lit chapel with light streaming in the window quite brightly. And again, I exposed for the highlights so they wouldn't be blown out, but they would be there, and then let the shadows fall away. Back in the day, they used to refer to this kind of effect as chiaroscuro. And chiaroscuro for portraits has a very long history. This is Caravaggio in 1610. And the definition of chiaroscuro is the use of strong contrasts between light and dark, usually bold contrasts affecting a whole composition. That's a pretty fair definition of low key as well. Yusuf Karsh is a famous Armenian-Canadian photographer who died in 2002, and I know you're familiar with that Winston Churchill portrait. You couldn't possibly not be. Karsh often used mostly dark tones and high contrast, not all the time, but a great many of his portraits are done this way to beautiful effect. I don't shoot a lot of portraits myself, and still fewer in low key, mostly because when I do shoot portraits, they're usually older women, and low key is often not the best choice for older women. But in this case, I was doing a different kind of portrait. This one has more midtones than some of my low key images, but the high contrast and the overall darkness are there. You can do low key in color, of course, but I find it is more common to see it in black and white. This was a rose that I used light painting for. So I was in a completely dark room with my shutter speed quite slow. I don't remember exactly what it was. It might have been 2 to 4 seconds, something like that. And I used a flashlight to light the petals of the rose. So this would be a low key in color. And then this is the low key in black and white. In this particular case, I think I prefer the color, but very often, most often, you'll see low key in black and white. Here we have curves, light, and texture. And those really come out in monochrome, and the dark backgrounds help those come out even more. So we have a magnolia bud on the left-hand side and the leaf of a calla lily plant on the right-hand side. You can see there's mostly dark tones and then some light tones to create the high contrast that we need to have a low-key image. Sometimes you can get a feeling of mystery and sensuality when you're shooting with low key, just a suggestion of what's going on. So let's talk about processing for low key. It might not have made a lot of sense to you when I told you to expose to the right when you're doing low key, but actually it works very well. This is what I would call a normal exposure. I'm exposing more over to the right. I didn't get quite to the edge, but exposing more to the right to retain the detail. I want all the information, and most of that information that your sensor captures is in the highlights and whites. If you know you want low key, you might or might not shoot with a bit of underexposure depending on your subject, but you do want detail in your highlights. This is not a terrifically high contrast subject. It's the leaf of a calla lily, and that looks pretty horrible the way it is right now. But this is the image that I ended up with. This is what I knew I wanted. So the original histogram of that color photo that you saw a minute ago is here. And then at the bottom, you see the histogram after processing. So I moved the blacks and whites or curves, not the contrast, to bring out the contrast, reduce the exposure to reduce the midtones, and then did some dodging and burning using luminosity masks to make sure that those veins in the leaf stood out the way that I wanted them to. The shadows in this side-lit tulip stem and leaf really lent themselves to a low-key treatment. So we have the original shot on the left and then the low-key on the right. Using the sliders in Lightroom, I made the greens and yellows darker and adjusted the tones and the contrast using the blacks, shadows, highlights, and white sliders. And you might or might not consider the original color version to be low-key. I wouldn't call it low-key, but the black and white one definitely is. Here, I knew I wanted a low-key image. I had a vision for this image. This is, as you see it, pretty much straight out of camera. What I did here was I was in not a dark room, but a dimmer kind of room. I was about 15 feet away from the nearest window in the daytime. And I laid a flashlight on the table behind and to the left of these stones. The stones are a very, very light gray. And this is the image that I was imagining and that I managed to make from that. I think this is a beautiful low-key image. It's very simple. I took the midtones and shadows down and adjusted the highlights to create the contrast that I wanted in the image. This is not a particularly high contrast scene, but the blow from the whale and the sunlight on the water do provide some contrast. So I thought I would play with this and see if I could come up with a low-key version of this. And this is what I ended up with. By lowering the luminance in the background and adding a vignette and adjusting the tones of the yellows and greens, I was able to create this low-key version. And I don't know, I think I prefer the color, but I think this has something too. Something that I sometimes enjoy playing with is taking a daytime shot and turning it into a nighttime shot. This doesn't always work, but it can be fun to experiment with, trying to get a moonlit look, which would be low key, right? So the original histogram on this was a pretty normal histogram with a hump pretty much in the middle. The tones were distributed across the histogram. There were lots of midtones in this, as you can tell by looking at it. So here, same shot, same original raw file. I dropped the exposure, which affects the midtones, and I dropped the darker tones and even dropped the highlights and then just nudged the whites up to get the contrast. And now to me, this looks like a moonlit scene. I did much the same here with this shot taken at Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia. This was shot in the daytime. And of course, there were a lot of people. There are always a lot of people at Peggy's Cove. I had to take multiple shots and layer them and take the people out on each shot and end up with this look. But then I thought, let's play with it. Let's turn it into a low-key nighttime scene. And it looks like it's moonlit. It actually was shot on the full moon, but not at nighttime. Similar effect here. This was a daytime shot. You can see the shadows cast by the trees. You can tell that it was a fairly hard light kind of situation. And then I processed it much the same. As I say, this doesn't work with every picture, but it does work with some of them, and it's fun to play with. I have a relatively new project lately that I'm calling digital etchings, and they're good examples of low key because they're made with black backgrounds with lesser amounts of midtones and highlights, and then I've got some whites in there. So it's high contrast and mostly dark tones. And I have had several of these do quite well. I started this project with focus stacked flower images, and then I moved on to a few other kinds of subjects. Here was an orca shot on a very calm day where the water was quite glassy. and could eliminate all the details in the background and just make that orca really stand out. So a low-key image. The first shot here is what I envisioned. I was doing an exercise that I'd set myself to create kind of an Edward Weston sort of look. The standard shot was just taken on an iPhone 13, and I wouldn't call this high key or low key. There's too many lights for it to be low key, and there's too much contrast and too many darks to be high key. But then I played with the low key look for a very different feeling, and got the one on the right that is a low key feeling. I would call that one low key. I see I've cropped it off on the edge though. Sorry about that. Missed that when I was editing. Here, the image is no longer low key, but it does give you an idea of what you can do with shots like this. You can kind of play with things, combine a low key image with an image that isn't low key. And I really enjoy getting creative with post-processing. So I kept on playing with this. This might be considered borderline low key, maybe. It's definitely got high contrast, but it's got a fair bit of light tones in it. So it would be at one end of the continuum. And this one, I wouldn't call this high key or low key. There's contrast, but there's too many light tones. And this one, I think you maybe could make a case that it's low key. This first one, definitely low key. The second one, maybe kind of borderline. And these were also made from that same Nautilus shell shot, both of these. In the final analysis, it's really not whether our photo meets the criteria for high key or low key or anything else that should matter to us as photographers and as artists. The important thing is that the technique you use works for your vision for the image and what you want to communicate. Now, if you're competing, read the requirements for the competition very carefully because you want to make sure that you're meeting those criteria. But when you're just making art for yourself, the most important thing is that the image works for what you're trying to say. Here we have a low key, one of my digital etchings, and then the inverse of it has too much contrast to be considered high key. You could take that contrast down and turn it into a high key image. I'm showing you these just to give you an idea so that maybe you'll go and play with some of your own images and see what you can do with them. This original of the Nautilus show was not shot intentionally for high key or low key, but it could be made into either. That's not true of every image you take, but sometimes it can work. Some final thoughts about high key and low key. First of all, you really need to match your subject and mood to the technique rather than just using the technique because you think it looks cool. Take lots of practice shots, not to show anyone, but to build your skills. Try that white sheet in bright sun exercise for low key. And then on a cloudy day, shoot the same white sheet to create a high key look. Point a flashlight at a dark subject in a dark room, or use flash in a dark room to create a low key image. Take that photo of the white plate on a white tablecloth in soft side light for high key. And try using ETTR for everything, not just high key. You might really be surprised. When I am learning a new technique like this, I often will keep notes on what I tried and the results I got. So I urge you to just play and have fun and take note of what works for you. I want to finish here with an invitation to have a look at my website, and you'll see, although I don't have high key and low key galleries on there, you will see lots of high key and low key images. And at that point, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to take any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I do have, if you're interested, I do have a demonstration that I can do of processing. But I thought we would take an opportunity for some questions first. Melanie?
Yeah, that sounds good. I don't think we have anything in the box. We've all been mesmerized looking and taking in all the information that you gave us. So, does anyone have any questions? You could even open your mic and ask them without typing.
I think it'd be very nice to see a demonstration, quite honestly, Melanie.
Yes, yes.
Okay, in that case,
I think we'll go straight into that, Judy.
okay, I'll share my screen again. I've set up, I'm going to try it with this screen. We'll see how that works. So I'm going to get my Zoom stuff moved over. And you should be seeing my Lightroom. Is that what you're seeing?
Yep.
Good. Okay.
Yes, yes.
So here we have, first of all, a pretty spur of the moment portrait that I did of this woman who had invited me onto her boat to get a better vantage point to shoot some birds. And complete stranger to me, but I liked the look of her, and I asked her if I could do a portrait of her very quickly, and she said sure. So I want to show you, this is the original file, and I wanted to turn it into something like this. There's the high key. So how do I do that? Well, in my develop module, I can start by taking the exposure up a little bit, which affects the midtones, right? So there's 0.85, and I'm winging this, guys, so be patient. And I'm going to take the highlights down a little bit. I'm going to change it to black and white. Now, I could go into the profiles. I could go into the profiles here and see if any of these profiles work for me, but frankly, I don't usually do that. There's one we could try. That one might be a little too much. That's not bad. So back to here. Now, I want this shirt, which was blue, to be much lighter than that, because that won't do for high key. So I'm going to go into my black and white adjustment sliders, and I'm going to take the blue way up, and the aqua, just in case there's some aqua in there. And then back to my basics, I'm going to bring up my shadows a lot, like all the way. I'm going to bring up my blacks quite a bit. Now I want to check, my highlights are not blown out. You can see on the histogram, but I think they might be just a little too bright. So I'm going to pull the highlights all the way down. So I've got blacks all the way up, highlights all the way down, haven't touched the whites yet, shadows all the way up. And then I'm just going to play with the whites. And one of the tricks I can use is on a Mac, hold down the Option key. And as you slide that slider to the right, anything that shows up white is blown out. So in this case, I don't really want tremendous blown out, but I'm not worried if a few areas are. I just want to make sure that we can still see the detail in her face. And of course, because we know that Caucasian skin tones are made up mostly of orange and red, we could play with those tones too. Like, we could make her look really bad. I have a preset for Caucasian skin that I use most of the time, but there I've taken up the reds and oranges, taken up the blues and aquas quite a bit. And I think you'd agree that that ends up being a high key portrait. Now, if I knew I was going to go out and do a shoot with this woman and I wanted to do high key, I would ask her to wear a shirt that wasn't a dark color like that. But even having that, well, that's what I ended up to show you. That's what we ended up doing it together. And there's the original image. So, you know, if you are going to be shooting somebody and you know you're going to do a high key portrait, then do ask them to wear some lighter colors, but it's not impossible to work with those blues, take them up. And then the other one I was going to have for you, we still have a little time, was the orca. I thought I'd show you how I did the orca. So this is not a tremendously high contrast kind of image. And this is what I ended up with. So let's see if we can duplicate that. And again, folks, I'm winging it, so bear with me. So we know we want high contrast and lots of dark tones. So I'm going to go into my develop module. I'm going to make this black and white, and I'm going to go to my basics, and I'm going to turn the exposure down because I want my midtones darker. And then I'm going to take my blacks down, because I don't really care if things go really, really black. I want a little bit of detail in the rocks there, but not much. And my whites, we can play with those. Let's push them up a little bit. Yeah, that's not bad. But we're getting a lot of midtones at the bottom. So I'm thinking I want to use a vignette on this. So go to my vignettes and just take that down. So let's see how close I got to what I showed you earlier. There's what we just did. There's what I had shown you. I don't know, maybe we did a better job. I think maybe the
I notice you don't use the tone curve at all.
I rarely use the tone curve in Lightroom. I will use it in Photoshop. But often I find if I can do what I want to do in Lightroom, then I don't bother with Photoshop. So we might, just tweak these. I might take the exposure down, the highlights up, just play with it until it looks right to you, and then go away for a few days, come back and see if you still like what you've got. Yeah, I think the tone curve is a wonderful tool, but it's not you can't finesse it in Lightroom the way you can in Photoshop. So if I want the tone curve, I go to Photoshop. So that got us pretty close. And that's what I had for you as a demo. So I'm going to stop my share. And
you made it look so easy.
Brilliant, thank you.
well, it does take practice.
Yes, super. So great explanations. It really made us truly understand both of those high and low key. So thank you very much, Judy.
Oh, my
So
pleasure.
do we have, oh yeah, we've got a question. Richard says, are more insights into high key missed shots. So how would you take and process high key missed shots, Judy?
Well, I would expose to the right. I'd make sure my histogram was already all the way over to the right-hand edge, and turn your blinkies on so that you don't overblow those highlights. And then when you get it into your processing software, you need to evaluate, do you have enough light tones? Do you have any real dark tones in it? Because your subject matters, of course. If you're taking a misty shot and it's birch trees, for example, they have pretty light colored trunks, so you're probably going to be in good shape. But if you've got trees with very dark trunks, then the darkness is going to be there, and you might have to really work with the luminosity masks or whatever to bring those up. But choosing your subject is an important part of that. So the picture you saw of the boat disappearing into the fog, that was great because there was nothing dark in the picture. Now, originally, that photograph had some dark rocks in the foreground. And as such, with the rocks, it wasn't high key. But when I cropped it to just show the boat in the mist, then it was high key. So you need to think about what tones are in the scene or in the subject, and then expose to the right, and then tweak it afterwards in post.
Excellent.
Something else you can try, I should have mentioned, is if you use Nik Silver Effects Pro, there are a couple of high key presets in that, and they can be a good starting point, but don't kid yourself that just by hitting those presets, you automatically have a high key image. You don't. So there's really no shortcut to getting the perfect high key post-processing. It is going to take some tweaking on your part. But I don't use Nik for high key and low key very often because it's not a precise tool. It's a bit of a sledgehammer. And I find I can do just as well in Lightroom. Sometimes I'll go to Photoshop, but Lightroom, I would say 95% of the time does the job for me.
I think it does for a lot of people, but other people hate Lightroom.
Yeah, well, and Adobe Camera Raw, of course, if you don't like Lightroom.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course. Any more questions, anybody? I think we're going to say it was so so much information. I think you've given it everything to us already.
Let's hope we see some nice high and low key ones in our next competition.
We are actually having one that features mono, aren't we?
Yes.
Yes.
So that is one of the reasons why the competition has been set when it is, so that everybody can practice and then put in fantastic images for the competition.
I think we should all go and buy calla lilies because they are a great subject. Not only the flowers, but the leaves.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you buy plants or do you grow them, Judy?
I live in a condo and I have a very tiny garden, but it is full of calla lilies and tulips.
Really?
And I find it difficult to find cut callas to buy here. So that's
Yes.
why I grow my own for the most part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the
You
leaves
could,
are great for low key and the flowers are great for high key.
yeah. All purpose
Yeah.
colour lilies. And it doesn't really matter what colour because you can change. You showed us that you could have coloured ones and
Yeah.
they good subjects. Excellent.
Exactly.
Okay, so let me just share my screen once more to just show you that our next presentation is a mono bouquet with Celia Henderson, and that's on Wednesday, April the 23rd at 10 a.m. in the morning. So Celia, you know, is very good with her flowers, so she's choosing to do a mono bouquet. So that should be interesting and something different again. So look forward to seeing lots of you on that occasion. And just to say thank you so much for joining us, Judy. It's been wonderful once again. And we may see you again. You aren't able to watch our other ones live, but you are catching up with the recordings and finding you're learning something. So that's amazing as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can't wait for Celia's talk.
No, that's good. So lovely. Thank you very much, Judy. Good to see everybody and see you all again on the 23rd.
Thank you very much,
Bye,
Judy.
everyone.
Thank you.